Good afternoon, everyone. Start?
Yes.
10 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is Moundir Lassassi. I am delighted to be here as moderator and discussant for this session on women labor supply and labor market experience. It is a great topic in our region. So we have four excellent and original papers on the topic of human labor supply. And so each presentation we have 10 minutes, and after I want some feedback, and after we open the floor for discussion. So let's go with the first presentation. Dear Mahdi Majbouri, you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mahdi. Thank you very much for being here. I never presented in a room with these many scholars in, so this is my first time with over like 30 people sitting in front for my presentation. So this is a paper about measuring preferences towards women's employment. And I apologize in advance to my colleagues, my Egyptian colleagues. This is a study that I did in Egypt, even though I know little about Egypt. And the reason was that I couldn't really do it in my country. I'm from Iran. So, and the best second country was Egypt because of its large size of population. I wanted to collect my own data, and Egypt had the largest online panel that I could get, and therefore I could do a better study. The best study I could have done was in Egypt. But I would really appreciate your comments on this. So this paper is fundamentally about the puzzle of female labor force participation in the Middle East, and you are very familiar with it. Many of you have written many papers on this for many years. In the Middle East, education of women has gone up rapidly, more than the rest of the world. Fertility rates have gone down, as you can see in the second figure. Rapidly, again, better, more than the rest of the world, but labor force participation for women has been relatively stagnant. So that puzzle had many explanations that scholars have came up with. The explanation I am focused on here is preferences of men and women towards different jobs for women. And I'm going to explain it this way. So some people argue that one reason that people might not be interested in, women might not be interested in working in the labor market is that their husbands don't let them work. So this is data from the Arab Barometer, and it's across the Middle East, like all the countries you can see here, Arab countries. And they asked men and women, how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? A married woman can work outside the home. And as you can see, pretty much close to 80% of men say agree or strongly agree. And a minority, about 30%, sometimes for Morocco it's about 40%, but for other countries, less than 30% disagree. And when you ask them specifically, how much do you agree with this statement? A married woman can work outside the home if she wishes. The percentages roughly stay the same. They change somehow, for example, for Syrian refugees, but not much. So there doesn't seem to be evidence that we have discrimination inside the household, that, like, for example, husbands prefer that their wives don't work. We don't see this in the Arab Barometer. But it could be because people don't want to say that they don't like their wives to work. Or it could be that they don't have any problem with their wives working. If the job is right, there is no problem, right? So that brings us the question of what job is right? And that's basically the topic of this paper. So in this paper, I collected an online survey, 450 men, 450 women, and these were in urban areas in Egypt. I collected demographic questions, of course, and then after that, I ran a set of discrete choice experiments. So what do I mean by that? Basically, in these experiments, I give 2 different jobs to men and women, to respondents, and ask them to say which job they prefer. So I ask women, which of these 2 jobs you prefer for yourself? And then I ask men, which of these 2 jobs you prefer for your wife? And then I ask women, which of these 2 jobs do you think your husband would prefer for you? And then I ask men, which jobs do you think other men would prefer for their wives? So in this way, we're going to measure what type of jobs do people prefer. So these jobs have 4 characteristics. One is whether the job is full-time or part-time, because the literature says that's important. Another one is whether it's in public sector or private sector. And the other one is, this is what I added, actually. It asks whether the job is an all-female environment, work environment, like everybody, all the colleagues are women, or whether it's in a mixed gender environment. So some colleagues are men, some colleagues are women. And then the last characteristic is the wage. So the wage would be different between the 2, and the characteristics also can be different. And then people have to choose. And I only chose 3 characteristics, basically, plus wage 4, because I didn't want people to be overwhelmed with so many characteristics, right? I just picked the top 3 that I had in mind: full-time, part-time, public, private, or female mixed gender. And as you can see here, full-time, this is part-time, but both of them are in public sector. One of them is in all-female, one of them is in mixed gender, right? So I randomly changed these characteristics. And I asked these questions 7 times, different ways. And then asked them, okay, choose which one do you prefer, right? And then based on this, you can estimate how much people are willing to pay for each of these characteristics. Or in my case, how much people are willing to accept as a wage penalty for each of these characteristics. So let me show you quickly the results because time is passing. My sample is not great. Like I have 80% of my sample have college degree because it was a sample that was collected online. So 80% have college degree. But still, I think the insights that we get are interesting. So first thing, so these are the wage penalties. Each of these estimates that you see are wage penalties. How much people are willing to accept as a penalty for different characteristics. So first one is this number. This is, so these are the 3 characteristics: all female versus mixed gender, full-time versus part-time, government versus private sector. And this is women's preferences. This is women's perception of their husbands' preferences, what they think their husbands would prefer. This is men's preferences. This is men's preferences of other men's preferences, right? Men's perceptions, sorry, of other men's preferences. Okay, so first women's. It seems, so what does this number mean? A positive number means that you have to pay, like the employer has to pay the employee for that job characteristic. So this means that women, if a job is in an all-female environment, you have to pay women to accept that job. And I'm going to show you in the next slide that most women, married women in particular, they don't care whether the job is in all-female environment or a mixed gender environment. Single women prefer mixed gender environment, slightly. So this positive number is because of single women, really. And then when you ask them, okay, what do you think your husband would prefer? They think that husbands actually prefer an all-female environment, so this is negative. So husbands are willing to accept 9% in wage penalty, like they accept a 9% lower wage if the job is in an all-female work environment. But then when you ask men themselves say, basically, when you estimate 63%, they accept the 63% in wage penalty for an all-female work environment. That means they really don't like a mixed-gender work environment. They really like an all-female work environment. And this is six times larger than this number. So men think like this, but women don't know about it. Right? Women don't know that their husbands think like that. And then when you ask men what other men are willing to pay, that's 43%. Almost similar to this. Like, you can't really say that these two numbers are statistically different. So men have a good sense of what other men would think. And then on the next characteristic, this is also interesting. When you ask people full-time versus part-time, people actually prefer full-time. And the numbers are very similar, about 30% wage penalty. Everybody almost prefers full-time. And here the reason is, I think the reason is that the total pay for the full-time is larger. Because the total pay is larger, people choose full-time more than part-time. And then, all right. And then the next one is about government, whether it's in the government or private sector. So women prefer government sector. So they prefer, women, yes, exactly. Women prefer 5%, 5.6% in wage penalty if the job is in the government. And 9.8%, almost 10% if the job is in the government sector. But men don't care that much. So if you look at men, they don't really care if it is in the government or private sector. Oh, 2 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to just quickly show you single women. So you see the preference for mixed gender environment is only for single women. You won't see that for married women. And so that was the most important thing. These numbers are the same. Oh, the other thing is that single women highly prefer full-time job. So they are willing to accept 53% in wage penalty if the job is full-time. Because, again, the total pay is higher. And then married women, here married men also have a high wage penalty for an all-female environment. So if the work is in an all-female work environment, they are willing to pay a lot of wage penalty. Although here the coefficient is statistically insignificant. I'm collecting more data to see if it is a zero coefficient or if it is a large coefficient, but I don't have enough data to identify this. So I'm going to skip that. So in summary, so this is the summary. I'll leave you with this slide. Men are willing to pay a 63% wage penalty if a job is in an all-female work environment. Men also more or less accurately predict what other men's preferences are. Women, especially single women, strongly prefer full-time jobs and are willing to pay 40% wage penalty for that. Unlike men, married women are indifferent to the gender mix of the work environment, but single women prefer mixed gender work environments, the opposite of men. And everyone prefers full-time jobs, potentially because the total pay is higher. Thank you so much.
I just summarize the paper. So the paper provides evidence on the role of preference in the household and explain the low participation of women in the labor force in the MENA region. The author examined the discrimination on the supply side hypothesis, that is, the husband not allow their wives to work. They used the discouraged choice experiment, online survey, asking preference on women and men for 3 aspects of jobs: full-time versus part-time, government sector. Thank you. versus private sector, and being in all. Shukran. So, thank you. And third, being in all female versus mixed gender work environment. So empirical analysis, author used the discrete choice experiment to estimate women's and men's willingness to pay for 3 jobs, whether a job is part-time, full-time, private, government, or mixed gender, or family female work environment using mixed logic choice model. In addition, author estimate women's perception of their husband willingness to pay for each job attitude, and men's perception of the men's willingness to pay for those attributes. So some results, author find that men who have veto power over women's decision to work are willing to pay 50% wage penalty if a job is in all female environment versus mixed gender environment. They are willing to pay 25% wage penalty if a job is a full-time versus part-time, but there are indifference between a government sector versus private sector. Women strongly prefer full-time jobs for both single and married women, and are willing to pay 40% wage penalty for that. And like men, they slightly prefer mixed gender environment over all female. They are also indifferent between government sector versus private sector. They also find that husbands prefer all family work environment over mixed gender once, and overestimate how much their husband like government sector jobs. So some comments. In the paper, the design of the online survey is not sufficient, not well presented. So you should present, you know that all results depend on the design of the survey. And we know that the limit of online survey is the representativity. So how you deal with this. And also the problem in the online survey, so we have selection bias in the case that not all women, not all people know how to use the technology to ask the survey. Also, you find that women in general and working women in particular have a strong preference for full-time jobs. First, the result depend on the level of education of women, and also the household condition. And second, empirical work in our region find opposite results. So I put the work of Rana Hindi. In the case of Egypt, they find that women prefer more part-time jobs. So how you deal with this? And also the results depend on the place of residence and the generation. Between generation, the behavior of women and the behavior of couples differ in generation to another generation. Also, in our region, the decision to work depends first on the husband, but also they can depend on the family of the husband. And sometimes the family influence the husband to allow or not women to work. The behavior changed, but we still have this in some Arab countries. And you find also that there are also indifference between government sector versus private sector. In the literature, we find opposite results. We find that women prefer public sector because of the flexibility, because of no monetary benefits. So some comments, and we will open the floors for other comments. Yeah.
Are these two different countries, or are we talking about the same country?
Egypt. Egypt.
It's all in Egypt.
Yeah, I discussed the paper of Mahdi. Yeah. Okay.
So, Mahdi, thank you very much for this interesting paper. First of all, I have an issue with this term preference to describe this. We know that it's driven by social norms, and social norms are not really preferences. Positions of constraints. And so I think you might want to think about how this, the wording, preferences versus social norms, and when you look at the opinion of other men, in fact you're looking shaping their preferences. But my question to you is, how do you deal with potential interactions? So the way I would value full-time job in the public sector may be very different from the way I would value full-time job in the private sector. So my willingness to pay for part-timeness or full-timeness may differ depending on whether it's a public sector job. The second issue is private sector jobs are extremely heterogeneous, right? There's informal and formal private sector jobs, and we know from existing data that women put very different values on these two. And so I know you didn't want to increase the dimensionality of your problem, but your risk having is very little, and people understand when you say private sector, they may think large corporations because you're just this preferences. And so I want to see how you just
Yeah, actually, I didn't hear all of Zach's comments, but mine might be a bit like this. The first one is that I'm not sure what conclusion you draw from the presentation. But, so what? Especially that there are three factors that you are talking about. Second, I mean, the determinants of women's work, or willingness to work, or quitting the labor market, it's in a very large literature. I mean, we know quite a bit, and we know that wage is not the only determinant. There are many other factors, including distance or the quality of the transportation, which having a good transportation to work or being very close to work is very important. I mean, mobility or being close to, and the possibility of having daycare for the children is very important. And there's a lot of factors that are important to understand why women, why the rate of activity of women is low in our region. To my knowledge, husband's attitude is not so different. Maybe they want their wives to have a decent job, which is not, good enough security, a good job, and women themselves want that. By itself, it's not a good thing, because the man need to have decent job with enough security as well. So perhaps I don't have to deal with all the variables I mentioned, but it would be good to make sure that what we did fits in this literature, and take out of it what is really new, and I think it's quite interesting.
So we take 1-2 questions, and after we take the second one.
Hello. So I enjoyed this presentation very much. I think one thing, think about trying to be more explicit about what models you ran, because I wasn't exactly sure what models or control variables. And the reason that my comment and suggestion might not be relevant if my interpretation of your model is not correct. But do you actually know, like, the women, what they chose, what their work choice was? So you might consider rethinking how you're doing the modeling, where it's like, here's what the women chose, and here's how the men's, the social norm or thinking of the man might have influenced that decision. You might even just do some descriptives at first, trying to understand the relationship between the actual choice, because you don't have to ask them what would they want, because you actually know what they chose.
So we take Aysel, Rana, Hindi.
80% of your sample are college graduates, and they don't accept any job except the public sector. Private sector is already very small in Egypt, and college graduates do not accept jobs in the informal sector. And so they have would like to mention, if I'm not mistaken, survey of the health and demographic survey has some of these questions, if I'm not mistaken, has some of these questions asked
Yes.
to women and their husbands. So you may want to check the health and demographic survey for
Yes.
Egypt and maybe for other countries as well.
Yeah, I think work value survey also, under work value survey, under the gender role attitudes. I think they ask this question.
Multiple indicator survey, they ask the question.
Yeah.
Conducted by UNICEF, and the equivalence in Egypt is DHS survey.
But even it's like, it's not enough representative because 80% is a college graduate of the attendance, but even it's like that because we expect that college graduates should be a little bit against, or I mean, to be against or not to get married or the kind of houses that they don't allow them to work in mixed environment. So, because education supports the more freedom to women, they can choose those husbands who they can support in the working environment. Even college educated people are thinking like that. For me, it's really meaningful. They should think about the social norms that how much policies, education policies should matter in this country, how we can educate men to think about different maybe. I don't know, because then we lose labor supply of women. I mean, for these reasons, if women, they don't work still in this century, we lose a huge female labor force in the labor market, human capital, waste of human capital it is actually, to my opinion, I don't know. That or government should think about some policies to generate maybe not mixed environments if the citizens they work this or be, because Southern is like that for instance. They work, but they work in different environments. So I think policies should be implemented in a way what citizens want or I don't know. But yeah, that's the
Actually, I'm just curious, you might have mentioned this, but I didn't notice, whether the distribution, the age distribution and education distribution is similar among men and women or not.
It is almost, women are more educated, but not much.
Okay, age, so what about age?
70% of men are college educated, 80% of women are college educated, so it's not
And the age distribution is almost
age
similar.
distribution almost.
What is the age of the age?
It goes from 18 all the way to 65.
So
But
why are you
much
watching
of-
enough?
Yeah.
The gender, the official ones change a lot.
That's true. So I also split it by age. The only thing is that after age 45, the number of population is dramatically declining. So most of them are longer than 50. So thank you so much. This was fantastic. I
We have-
really appreciate all these comments.
And you have 3-4 minutes.
I'll be very quick. So social norms, that's excellent imposition of constraints rather than like preferences. That's an excellent comment. I should definitely mention that. Meaning of the private sector, true. I should actually show you the question in Arabic, and as you said, people might not really understand what it is. What I'm doing is that wages are also different. So people see a private sector job with higher wages than they see in the real world. And what I'm saying is that if the wages are the same, then men don't care whether it's public or private, as long as wages are the same. But in the real world, the wages are not the same. So that's maybe why people prefer public sector. And then the question of so what is a great question. My answer to that is, okay, imagine if these results are true, we can change preferences of social norms easily. But at least we know what the problem is. But if men are willing to imagine, if these results are true, men are willing to accept 63% in wage penalty. That's more than 50% in wage penalty. That's a lot of money. Nothing, it's very hard to change. It means that any government policy is futile. And as you can see, like, there's a sort of position of women has been stagnant. So that is actually supported by these results. That what's behind the low level of participation of women is so strong that government policy is basically futile. And maybe government should do something else. Like that money should go somewhere else that will address that.
Did you ask women what their decision is determined by?
Yes.
Did you ask women the extent to which the decision depended on their husband?
Oh, no. But this is an interesting question. If I had done this survey in Iran by law, men have veto power over women's decision to work. So women can think whatever they want. It doesn't matter. In Iran, not here, but in Iran that's the case.
But not legally.
Not legally, okay. In Iran, that's good. That's good because in Iran courts would support men. So legally, men would be completely supported. And then having some descriptive is actually a good idea. It's almost impossible because for each of these questions, I'm randomly changing wages. So men and women are answering different questions. Like even women are answering different questions because wages are different across them.
So what? Think about the private sector implications. Like what a company might want to do to have a mixed.
Right. So that's another thing. That's another thing that can be done. So maybe the policy is that we would encourage entrepreneurs to have all-female work environment, especially like women entrepreneurs. Maybe that's a solution. So the idea of 80% college graduates and the fact that they accept only public sector job, again, I would give an answer similar to what I just said, that in the real world, wages are very different between public and private. But here, I can play with wages the way I want. And I can see if the wages are high, people don't care. People don't care. And
Sorry.
yes.
You can pay. You being who?
Me. Look, when I design the question, I'm just a researcher. Like when I don't provide the job, but I just ask them.
Trying to understand, you have a situation where you have an option between public and private.
Yes.
Okay, and you're saying you can change what?
I change wages between these two jobs. So I can change the salaries. In the question, when I ask the question from people, I give them...
What results, how can you go back and change?
Oh, good question. For every person sees a different question. And every person sees a different wage. Some people see that the wage in the private sector is higher. Some people see it's lower. Some people see it's 20% higher. Some people see it's 5% lower. So everybody sees a different thing. And then they all, if you have enough observations, you can find the average wage penalty out of this. So that's why it's a complicated thing. Yes, I think I'm done.
The last question, and we move to student presentation. The last
Sure.
one.
I was just wondering, what does having a what does being a graduate mean? Are you talking about someone who has a PhD versus someone who just has a bachelor's degree? Because, when you look at women's participation in the labor force, poor women have to work. Families don't survive if you don't work, right? So there is, as you go up, in sometimes, okay, yeah, but then as you go up, there's an enormous opportunity cost to keeping somebody who is highly educated at home. It's like how many of these men can afford that choice is the question I'm asking. Are the wage differences so huge? So if you have, for example, a woman who has a doctorate and a husband who just has an undergraduate degree, like having that choice of the person staying home, it's an enormous cost to the entire family. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can you parse out the data more? What do you mean by
Yes.
Or somebody has, you know what I mean? Like,
That's a good question. I intentionally don't say them that because the literature doesn't distinguish between that. And so our previous research talks about public versus private, full-time versus part-time. Oh, and the idea of distance, one last thing. So for distance, actually, I can tell you some good news that Adam Osman has done a similar study in Egypt, but he has distance to work as one of the characteristics of the job, and it matters. I don't remember on top of my head how much the wage penalty was in his case, but distance to work definitely matters.
Thanks so very much. If you have time, we can come back after. So we move to the second presentation by Amira.
So hi everyone. So thank you so much for being there, and I'm very happy to see a lot of familiar faces in the room. So this is a topic that I'm personally passionate about. It's about who's paying bribes and how much bribes are being paid in the MENA region. And I'm tackling this issue using the gender dimension and in the business sector rather than focusing on households. So what motivated this study is not theoretical at all. I was at my hairdresser's. I was talking with her. She is very, very talented. And she was complaining that she is earning a very small amount of money and she doesn't make a lot of profits. So I asked her, why don't you go and have your own beauty salon? She's very, very talented. She is kind of one of the most talented I have ever seen. And she replied, I don't wish to deal with tax officials. I want to be shielded. And this is the term that she used in Arabic, shielded. She want to have this kind of layer of a business owner or a business manager who is in indirect interaction with the authorities, especially the tax authorities, rather than going herself and establishing or initiating her own beauty salon and earning or having all the profits for herself. So this was an honest conversation I had with her, and I knew from the literature and from a lot of papers that have already been done is that the MENA region suffers from the largest gender gap in labor force participation and also in the number of businesses being established, whether we have our indicator, the business owner, the business manager. We know that we have this gap by gender in the region. But I didn't know that the MENA region has one of the highest entrepreneurial intentions for women. So women in the MENA region have the highest intentions worldwide for opening new businesses. So they have these intentions, but the intentions are not being transferred to reality. They are not able to establish their businesses. And this suggests that there are a lot of barriers to them establishing their businesses or to women's entrepreneurship in the broader sense in the region. And I came across, I digged a little bit deeper, I came across this very interesting report. It's called Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and it reports on the average total early stage entrepreneurial activity rates by gender and country. And this simply is the percentage of the working age population in each country who have just established a business or are actively seeking to establish a business. And you can see here that for Egypt, for example, and the orange or the yellow color is for men, we know that men are going and establishing businesses with a very, very much higher rate than females. And keeping in mind that we know that females have the higher entrepreneurial intentions, so this means that a gap like this we are seeing in Egypt must be explained by a lot of factors. So I will skim quickly across the slides. So we know that there are a lot of research being done on obstacles facing women joining the labor force in Egypt and in the MENA region in general. We know that the literature covers discriminatory gender norms, lack of skills, etc. And we have a lot of prominent economists in the room who are actually working on these topics. For me, the obstacle that I wanted to focus about is corruption. So women in businesses, how they are perceiving corruption as an obstacle. Also, corruption incidents. So how much women entrepreneurs are involved in paying bribes or having or needing to pay bribes. But not also only this. how much bribes are women actually paying? And then later, after they have this corruption experience, how much this corruption experience changes their perception about corruption as an obstacle to their firms. And we know that women have a lot of networks, so they tend to share their experiences a lot. So if a female entrepreneur in the region have like a bad corruption experience, it's very likely, even like more than men, that this woman will go to her networks and she will share this among other females, etc. And this means that other females who were having these intentions to establish a business will be kind of disincentivized. So the objectives of this study is to look at corruption at 4 layers in the MENA region and to report separately for the MENA region and for Egypt. So the first question I'm asking, do female managers have a higher likelihood of paying informal payments? So this question basically covers the corruption incidents. Do they pay or not? We don't know. Then, if they paid, do they pay larger amount of bribes or smaller amount of bribes? And this question is not only the amount of bribes in magnitude that they pay, it's the amount that they have to pay. The third question is, let's say a female manager goes and pay the bribes. Was she requested to do so? So while interacting with tax officials in the MENA region, did the tax officials actually ask her or requested her to pay bribes? And the fourth, which is the corruption experience and how much it affects her perception about corruption as an obstacle to her operations. So basically, the first question is covering corruption incidents, the second, corruption magnitude, the third, corruption demand, and the fourth, perceptions of corruption afterwards or after like experiencing this corruption experience. And I'm working on a theoretical framework. Basically, we know in the literature that we have this kind of framework for corruption incidents and corruption magnitude. So these two kind of models, they already exist theoretically in the literature. What I'm seeking to do in this paper is to have like a more of a comprehensive framework. So I'm adding a layer backwards and a layer forward. So I'm starting with corruption demand, whether females are more likely to be asked to pay bribery. Then let's say they pay, do they pay or not, subject to being requested? And then let's say they pay, how much they actually paid, the magnitude of the bribes. And then based on this corruption experience, corruption incidents and magnitude, how much or like how likely female managers to be affected by this experience and to perceive corruption as an obstacle to their operations. So the parts in blue are the parts I'm seeking to add to the literature, and also given that the particularity of the MENA region that you are all familiar with, I'm adding this gender component to all like 4 layers and hypothesizing that they have different effects over the 4 layers of corruption study. Okay. So we have the literature on the incidents. We know that the corruption, the control rights hypothesis explains the incidence of corruption, the likelihood of being involved in corruption or like paying bribes. It depends on how much control does basically the government officials have over a firm. So let's say a firm is required to apply to get a water connection. So the firm needs something from public officials. So this basically, in the literature, what kind of control, whether firms will be engaged in corruption or not. And then we have the bargaining strength hypothesis, which determines the magnitude of payments being paid. So if a firm is making more profits, most likely in the literature, this firm will be paying larger amounts of bribes if it has so. So basically in this paper, I just extend this hypothesis in the literature, taking into account like one step backward, whether female managers are more likely to be asked or requested, and this is kind of the corruption demand aspect, and taking also this like framework one step forward. Let's say a female manager faces corruption experience, how much or like how likely is this affecting her perception of corruption as an obstacle to her operations? 3 minutes. So I will, okay, I can skip the model and I can go directly to the results. Mahdi, you took all the time. I didn't. Okay, so let me go directly to the results in the interest of time. Okay. So the data I'm using is the data from the World Bank Enterprise Survey, and it's like we have a panel structure, and I'm covering Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, West Bank, and Gaza. We have a sample size of more than 13,000 observations, but for this particular paper, I'm using only firms from the manufacturing sector, and this is based on the model specification that we need a capital labor variable which is not available for services sector, and by nature it's only available for the manufacturing sector. And we have like 3 waves, so it's a panel data structure. So these are like my main dependent variables covering the 4 aspects that I've just like mentioned: incidence, magnitude, demands, and perception of corruption. So these are the main dependent variables I'm using. And for the control rights, which is basically the control that the public official has over a firm, I'm using, let's stick to this, a formal sector index, which captures all the interactions required with public officials. And we already know that probably if a firm is interacting more with public officials or with the formal sector in the broader sense, it will be most likely to be subject to corruption. For the bargaining strength of the firm, which determines mainly the corruption magnitude or the amount of bribes being paid, I'm using the profits of the firm, which reveals like the ability or like ability of the firm to provide the bribes. I'm also using this measure in the literature, which is the alternative return on firm capital stock, which captures the refusal power of the firm. So let's say the firm refuses to pay bribes, it will have to exit the market, and then how much profits or like de facto profits it will be achieving from moving out and reallocating to other sector. I'm using the gender of top manager and also the visibility of the firm, or let's say the firm size. So these are like the results on the incidence of corruption, and you can see here that interaction with the public sector increases the likelihood of engaging in corrupt behavior, and we have different model specifications, but let's focus on this model specification 7. So the formal sector index is highly significant. Also, we notice here, and this is not reflected in the literature, or like it's a new result, that the bargaining strength of the firm and its refusal power actually affects the incidence of corruption and not only the magnitude. And for the gender of the manager, we observe here that being a female manager is not associated with a higher likelihood of being involved in corrupt behavior. So this is a yes or no. Do you pay bribes or not?
How many female managers do you have on percentage?
Around 10 to 12%, but the percentage is lower for Egypt, unfortunately.
And who responded? The managers respond to the question?
Yeah, the manager, yeah. The manager, or sometimes if the manager is not there, it's like a senior employee within the firm. Okay, and similar results are there for Egypt. The only difference between Egypt and the MENA region is that interacting with trade authorities is highly associated with a higher likelihood of having to pay bribes or needing to pay bribes. And this is not significant for the MENA region. So these 2 tables are for the corruption incidence. Let's come to corruption magnitude. So now the firm had to pay bribes. Are female managers more likely to pay higher amounts of bribes or not? So you can see here that female managers they tend to pay lower amounts of bribes in the MENA region. And we also observe that interacting with the formal sector affects the magnitude, which is not in the literature. So this is these results have not been reported by other studies. So most of the results or other studies separate between the determinants of corruption incidence and the determinants of corruption magnitude. But you can see here that what's most important in this table is women or like female managers paying lower amount of bribes if they had to. In this specification, and because we found that some of the factors or some of the determinants of the incidence are actually affecting the determinants of the magnitude of corruption, we ran the estimation jointly of the incidence and magnitude. And also we found that female managers tend to pay lower amounts of bribes if they had to. So these tables are basically covering the incidence and the magnitude of corruption by the gender of the firm manager. Now, there is like a common argument that, okay, women tend to pay lower amounts because they tend to be asked less to pay amounts, or they are not kind of very interactive at the firm level or like with officials. So to refute this argument, we ran the estimation separately for being requested to pay a bribe. So now here it's just like, have you been requested during interactions with tax officials to pay a bribe or not? And we found here that female managers are significantly more likely to be requested to pay bribes. So they are not paying lower amount of bribes because they are being requested less, but no, they are being requested significantly more than male managers to pay bribes. We also find here some, like it's significant but not highly significant, that the frequency of tax inspections in particular tend to be associated with a higher likelihood of female managers or like of managers being requested to pay bribes. Yeah. Yes. So this is the final slide. It's on the final stage or the final layer of corruption. So now we have incidence, magnitude, have you been requested or not, and then let's say you had a corruption incidence, whether it's measured by incidence, magnitude, or request, but you had this corruption experience as a manager. Is it likely to affect your corruption being perceived as an obstacle to your firm operations? And we found here that corruption experiences significantly affects your perception of corruption as an obstacle to your operations. So conclusions, and maybe I can focus on the first two because this is the ones that are kind of particular to the MENA region. So the first one is that gender differences in bribery incidents diminish in settings with weak control of corruption. And this is the situation in the MENA region. So women are not less likely to pay bribes, but when they have to...
Explain, please. What do you mean weak control? By whom?
Yes, so the weak control here is measured by the corruption perception index. So in countries where corruption is less controlled...
By whom?
By the government. So it's like it reflects the perceptions of people about corruption. So we don't have this official figure coming from the government. So women are not less likely to pay bribes, but they tend to pay smaller amounts of bribes if they had to. And this is not because they are not being requested less, because they are being requested more actually. And this tend to affect their perceiving corruption as an obstacle to their operations. So the next step is to create this link between weak control of corruption and to include it in the theoretical model, and also to have this kind of different, let's say, robustness checks for using different measures of corruption, transparency, something like this, and checking if the results vary by different indices for corruption or transparency. So I will stop here and okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We take 6 minutes from my time. Give you 6 minutes. I will skip to summarize the paper. Amira take all the times. So just so I skip this, I skip this. We don't have time. So just some comments and proposition for the paper. So the most important variable in your paper is the gender. So I think you should interact the gender variable with all other variables. The interaction will allow to observe the differences according to difference of characteristics. So interact with all. And also you estimate two models for Egypt and for MENA country. So if the sample allow, you can estimate for each country because the countries are different in the composition. And if the sample is small, you can just introduce a country dummy variable and interact with with all variables to see these differences between countries. I don't know if in the sample you have like variable membership in employer federation or association or of employers. They can protect women or men from the corruption. And also to include the number of years of experience of the manager and the location of the firms. So the distance between the firms and the fiscal agency. They can influence the frequency to visit the same companies. If they are far from the fiscal agencies, maybe they will skip. So we open the discussion. Farani, yes, sorry.
Just like quickly, what did you conclude in your model for? Like, did you conclude for the characteristics of the firm? Maybe you mentioned that and I missed it. But this will certainly affect, like, the size of the firm, for example, will affect the amount of the money she's being asked to pay. Besides, also, like, who's that we ask, like, the question about the incidents. Is it like when you ask for paying a bribe, or is your firm being asked to pay a bribe? Because she might be the manager, but she might not be the one dealing with every particular request in the government sector, and there's maybe like another person in the firm, and he's a male, and that's why you're not getting this significance in terms of the demand of the incidents, because you're showing that when she's about to pay.
These data can be very tricky because you got different time periods. Different countries are collecting it, so it's not every country at the same time period. So you want to make sure for country fixed effects and time fixed effects, and looking at some of the country differences, time differences, and trends. But the other thing I noticed, so I encourage you to think about maybe cleaning your data, just taking another step to make sure you have the same number of observations for every model, because it's difficult for us to know, okay, what's this sample, what's this sample, what's this sample, and what are we comparing? And to this end, it seems like sometimes there's this word cherry picking. Like you're deciding, okay, now I'm going to throw in these variables, now I'm going to throw in these. You might just for a clean presentation, just have control for all your factors without gender, and then all your factors with gender, and add some interaction terms. Then you get a stepwise approach. Otherwise, what happens is, one time you're stuck in gender, but only you took out corruption. Remember, why take out corruption? When you put in corruption, does the gender effect go away? So just think about this. It would help to make your results more solid, and for people to feel like, oh, okay, samples clean, stepwise regressions. So very nice.
Regarding we mentioned that women are more likely to pay less rights, but she's requested to pay rights. And you mentioned that this is, again, I mean, you attribute this, and at the point, that's why women, they don't want to be owners and to start a new business. So, but actually, I think this is something that we need to think about, because your sample is on the manufacturing sector. There might be, the woman is not, she doesn't want to be a business owner in the business sector. Particularly, you give an example from the service sector, not the manufacturing sector. My question here: did you check the women owners, and the percentage of the women owners in the manufacturing sector versus men? Also, something that I want you to, I think for
for the question of the firm size. I think you have to conclude with the firm size.
Take two questions.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very, very, very lovely presentation. I loved it. I only have one comment. So in corruption, there is active and passive corruption. So you looked mostly on when women are asked, what if they offer to give a bribe? So how would we perceive that? My other comment is mostly your testing experience is not perceptions. These are actual things that happen. So you'd rather report it as experiences because, again, in the literature, there's this big debate between perception and experiences. So these should be reported as experiences, not perceptions. And finally, what's very interesting is that in household research that has to do with corruption, women are less asked to participate and they pay less. So here it's very interesting that it's different. So also if you can highlight this discrepancy, it would be very interesting. Thank you.
So thank you so much for all these interesting comments. So I control for all firm characteristics, but I don't report them here because it's very, in the presentation it will be not digestible by the readers. I only control. So thank you so much for the feedback. So for the firm characteristics, I kind of withdraw them from the literature and I'm using them here, controlling for them all. But for the sake of the presentation, I couldn't kind of insert them here, but they are all included in the model. The same applies for the size of the firm because here I'm using it as a proxy for the visibility of the firm. So all characteristics from the literature are there in the model, but I didn't have the space to report them. And also on the idea of corruption perception versus experience. So in the enterprise survey data, we have different questions. So we have questions of actually being asked and then the amount you pay. And at the end, there is a question, but it's not related to the corruption. It's related to the obstacles that faces firm's operation. So they ask the firm directly, how much do you perceive corruption as an obstacle to your operations? So they use the word perceive and they say whether you perceive it very, let's say it's very difficult or very challenging obstacle.
If you ask the same person, the perception is the experience, also the perception is higher than the actual experience in the...
Yes, so yeah, because if you have a corruption experience, it's most likely that your perception will be higher. So when we have as a dependent variable the corruption perception, including the corruption experience as one of the explanatory variables or one of the determinants. But it's not the other way around in the literature. But focusing on perceptions is very much, it's a very valid point, thank you, so that I can elaborate more on having this corruption experience versus the perceptions part. Unfortunately, we don't have data on women who offer to pay bribes. If we have this data, maybe we can design a question, but it will be very useful to see this. But unfortunately, in the World Bank Enterprise Survey data, we don't have this. On the stepwise, the regressions part, so this is a stepwise regression. So each model specification carefully adds just one coefficient. So at the beginning, I focused just on the firm's interaction with government officials, and then later I add gender. So I add them one by one so that I don't include them because maybe they will be correlated. Also, I'm accounting for the year fixed effects and the country fixed effects. But also, I didn't report this in the model because, as you were saying, it's a large time span. So in Egypt, 5 years ago, it's not the same. So we have 3 waves per country, and the year fixed effects are included. Also, the firm fixed effects. But it's a very good idea, and I can take it forward by doing a proper step-wise regression that will help clean the results and giving even publishers more confidence that the results are not being cherry-picked. So these are just quick reflections.
The last one. You said there was a question about who actually paid, not about the paid, reported to justice or wherever. Do we have men and women?
So we don't have them by men and women. Unfortunately, we have them at the country level, just at the country level. So this is kind of just giving an indication of the institutional setting in the country, whether there is like a strong control over corruption or not. But unfortunately, not good. This is a big question. Yeah, and thank you. And this is why I separated Egypt from the rest of the sample.
Thank you.
Internationally, in the literature, women tend to report more than men because of the retaliation. Retaliation is less.
Because of what?
Retaliation of the authorities tend to retaliate less against, with employees in the government, they tend to retaliate less against women than men. And they report first.
Threats also different too.
That's because of retaliation.
No, I mean, when asked for bribes, I mean, women in certain contexts are asking for sexual
We can put this here. You can put here, yeah. Yes. This one. Yeah, yeah. Okay, keep. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so we will now move on to ERF for Mahdi.
Okay, so we have the instruction. Just 7 minutes.
Yeah, I will go fast, I'll try back, yeah. It's already many slides. I prepared already, no worries. I will try to skip most of them, no worries. So, I'll blame you. So, anyway, we're trying to see a bit the, taking a very, the typical model of intra-household resource allocation by Kapori, published in Journal for Political Economy. We will try to see the role, or I will not say the impact, but the role of asset ownership, gender role attitudes, and how also the violence can reduce the female supply and labor supply, and of course it can reduce the capability of women to work or to earn, and which has some costs. So this, I can skip. I will very briefly go to 3 or 4 main, let's say, theories of gender-based violence and the intimate partner violence, which is one of the one which happens in all the world actually, in a lower or higher degree, and of course can have some substantial socioeconomic repercussion. Okay, labor productivity, supply is lost, human capital is lost, and one, of course, the well-being can be lost, to go down, because health and happiness are two, I say, outcomes of well-being. So the motivation is just, again, why we explore this, because, okay, losing the female labor supply, reducing the role of women in the society, can also deteriorate kind of the, because women, other papers say they invest, if they have some wages, maybe they invest more money on children's expenditures. We don't do this here because the data don't allow, but they use like footwear or clothing or something that usually women maybe are more altruistic than men, and they care more for the children. And we can go even break it down if it's the gender side, if it's boy or girl. I will not go this one. So again, these objectives, and these are some theories. The one is expressive violence theory that says that actually, if you increase if the salaries of husband salaries increasing, maybe we can see a reduction of domestic violence, and of course they can have also some violence. They can can derive some violence direct from this action. And the second theory is the outside option, where because women increasing their labor supply, they're able to have better bargaining power, so this can reduce the domestic violence. The third theory is the I can show here the that they find that something, so they have some positive association between women's resources and domestic violence, and one is the main theories now. This is the main last theory, where actually this theory says that if the women gain higher weights, they can undermine the traditional law of husband as the main breadwinner of the family or the household. And the fourth one is the instrumental violence, or the resource extraction, where women, husband maybe can use violence in order to extract money from the women, so from the partner. So we have these theories based. We want to see based on these theories. what supports what the results actually show us. We will have For Egypt, we have this, we'll estimate jointly these two equations, the female labor supply and the male labor supply with some characteristics, the male and female weights, the household income, the interaction of this, and some demographic socioeconomic characteristics, and also, of course, some distribution factors using this model. I don't know if I have time. Of course, there's some limitations because the cross-section data, so that's the one issue. And the second is we don't know where this money goes. Okay, the women can have more bargaining power, but we don't know if it's going to children or it's going, I mean, how much is going to children. I mean, this is another question, but unfortunately, the data we don't have. So I'm giving a bit before the limitations of this exercise kind of. So we have general, I mean, what I'm saying, mostly we care for the domestic violence, and we split the regressions by 3 types. We don't want to see if you experience all together, maybe all together, but we want to distinguish if you have experienced physical, psychological, or sexual violence. So 3 different regressions. And then for each type, of course, we can avoid, we can have multicollinearity issue, but we want to see which has more effect. I mean, the physical is more dominate or the sexual, for example. Even sexual can be more proportionally, can be more often observed. And then we have another distribution factor, gender role attitudes can be an issue because the self-reported questions, we have issue with the self-reported perceptions. Different people rank in a different way. I mean, if you have, I mean, they say the husband has the right to beat the wife, they say strongly agree to strongly disagree. So there maybe you have a bit difference. It's like life satisfaction or happiness. Your happiness, my happiness can be different, so it's an issue. Anyway, so we create a gender with using a set of these variables. I don't remember how many, 6, 7, how many they are. And the other one is whether there is, when the women, females, have the own an asset. And we have by type of asset, like a building or kind of house, land, car. So we use the GMM, as I told you, so I'm going this female labor supply equation jointly with GMM and instrumental variables. We use again the typical literature they used in not only the instrumental variables, but also the type of, the type of the model. So we have some determinants here. Again, I will skip, but mostly we find, of course, what we expect. I mean, the domestic violence is negatively related with education attainment, and we have actually kind of this maybe confirm the theory of expressive violence, where educated people actually earn more, and so if females earn more, they can reduce, also the husband can earn more, they reduce the incidence of domestic violence. So the female asset ownership is negatively related to domestic violence, so maybe women, it says that they own an asset. We could be the opposite, because you own an asset, maybe the husband could be using violence to abuse, let's say, kind of this. But not in this case, at least on average. And conservative, I mean, role attitudes, again, is kind of not preference. Maybe those who are more conservative, they prefer maybe, I don't want to say, but not to prefer, they don't prefer, but it's because of social cultural norms, they face this kind of violence, because maybe they don't have a choice, but that's what we want to see. I mean, mostly we want to see the violence, but also we include the female asset ownership and whether the gender roles plays, the gender role attitude. So we see something that here, if the non-labor income increases, by one, I mean, the Egyptian pound we use, increase the male supply. So what I'm trying to say here, also forgot here, these factors, I mean, they reduce the female labor supply, and we want to see how much they lose in the end. I mean, how much they lose in terms, because if you lose, because of violence, you work less hours or work less days. So if you work less days, of course, you lose this income, so this salary. So losing this salary, it means you lose some, you lose the human capital, kind of. So as I said, the difference in spouse ages, there is a negative association. So the bigger the difference between the partners' age is the lower the female labor supply, so the lower also the bargaining power, and also the more conservative you have in terms of gender role attitudes, and the more of the violence, of course, what we found, you reduce the female labor supply because of these things. So the main again, what I'm saying, so what I'm saying, if you earn one increase by £1, women, the transfer is 0.28, and men's transfer is 0.15 less. So we see that here women behave more altruistic, let's say, than men. And we also find in other countries, I mean, for example, I was reading recently, Spain, they found something, not the same results, but the same concluding remarks, not the same estimates, but they found, for example, women behave more altruistic than men. And then, so what we see here, I mean, the main point, which is the domestic violence, the women, this is for women who experience the physical violence, they lose by average £2,500 per year because maybe they lost 10 days, I don't know, or 20 days, they didn't work because of physical violence, because of experience of this violence, compared to women, they didn't experience any type of violence. Okay, so no violence at all. And these costs are followed by the second biggest cost is for those who have experienced sexual violence, £1,960, and then finally those who experience psychological violence on £1,720. £20. And then also asset ownership increases the bargaining power of women, so they work more and increase the income actually by 3,200 on average £60 compared to those women again who don't own any ownership. So this kind of discussion, I mean, the education plays a role. The general attitude and the household, the domestic violence especially are negatively related with female labor supply, so they reduce the bargaining power of women, and the female asset ownership actually gives, let's say, empowers women. So as I said, the limitation is static, of course, is one, because we use only 2015 data in Egypt. We don't have panel data, we don't have the time dimension or something, or even pooled, or not even cross-section. And the other thing is we have this data, but there is no enough observation to do this one. The respondent, I mean, we can see if they have injuries, mental issues, or even they went to hospital, and there is information in the survey how much they paid, but it's so few. I mean, most of them maybe they didn't reply, or there is no enough. I mean, maybe we came down with 20, 30 observations, so we cannot make any conclusions. But it will be nice also to see whether this violence had some injuries and how much they paid, because it says in the survey, did you use the surveys and how much you paid? What, I mean, mentally or physically, or some hospitalization, you receive some treatment because of these injuries, and how much will it cost? It would be also maybe nice to use, but the data is so weak. So, thank you. I will. I think it'll be 5 minutes. How many minutes? How many minutes? Did I say minutes or? Wait. Really? Really? Don't worry. Better. Really? Wait. I can keep this one. Or...
I have just few comments. So we find that the differences is have a negative effect on the violence. So how can you explain the negative effect of the age differences? The hypothesis that the age differences can increase the violence. And also, so the age differences is important, as well as the difference in level of education. So if you have in the data information to cap the difference in level of education, and also the difference in the location. So from the area between men and women.
Yeah.
And I think you estimate the first wage equation.
This is Helene selection model, yeah. Helene selection, yeah.
Education is endogenous, so you must
take it question.
experimental variables
Yeah.
for the education. For the education.
Yeah.
And after you can also, so you have the differences in the age, level of education, location, but also the gap of differences between the wages between men and women. So you can predict in the first...
But regions, you mean are couples, they stay together, are they married couples?
Yeah.
How would take the difference of regions? Between couples?
Two couples. If they come from urban or rural areas...
Ah, okay. No, but they are couples, they are married. Only married people are taking this. This model is all for married people. But I'm controlling for this, I think. Yeah, I control. Maybe also.
Predict the way to the first steps.
Yeah, but I have control in my tables. I have, maybe I didn't show, but in the paper I have urban and rural region. Yeah, and also I'm controlling the districts like instruments. The district, yeah. But okay, yeah, understood. Yeah. No, but the model works like that. It's a very standard model, this Chiapori. It's the standard model. You cannot change. So if you read the night, I mean, it's general political economy, this pay, I mean, I didn't do something new. It's just innovative. It's just an exercise. Just I put additional distribution factors. So if I was using sex ratio or age difference, I'm just using gender role attitudes and the violence, domestic violence. So this is the model. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, 2015, yeah.
First of all, we are aware that the reported education level of husbands and the wages are reported by the woman herself.
Yeah.
One of the things
Yeah, this, yeah.
definitely noticed that there were, I don't recall maybe 2,000 observations or something like that on wages of males.
Yeah.
So this is one thing regarding.
But here I'm doing Heckman selection model, so I'm doing the reservation weights, yeah.
And one other thing that might be interested to include in your values, I don't know whether you put
Yeah.
it or not. There was a question about whether she lives near her family or close to her.
I think I use, yeah. There is, there is, yeah. Even sorry interrupting, even the husbands relatives live together. Even there is this question, even this additionally. Yeah. This is the asset ownership. Yeah. But that's, wait. It is fast. It was fast. Sorry, it was fast. That's why.
But there was actually a report about estimating the cost of
Yeah, and I think I used this like citation, a report from the MENA region. I think something. There was a report. I think globally. Wow, for Egypt also. Yeah. No, there was statistics. How much you use? Yeah.
And it estimated the cost of gender.
Yeah.
Using the labor, there's number of days she missed and her work,
Yeah.
and the injuries and the amount of money she paid for her.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, for the age difference also, I think it's not so interesting what we found.
Yeah.
Age difference, if the man is older than
Okay.
is
It's more,
face with
No,
less violence.
no, and also more. They are happy with the young women. That's why. Yeah, when it's more different, it's more reaction, more fight. Yeah. So what do you do now? We finish the thing. How many papers we have? 4. Wait.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation today is on migration impact on the empowerment of women left behind. And why we're interested in this, because Egypt is a net immigration country, and as you can see, the international migration stock for men is increasing over time. There is a positive trend. And if we look at this international migration stock by gender, actually 63% of it are male, and it's increasing for male and female. So it's very important to study this phenomena. And if we think about it, which countries that Egyptian males they migrate to, there are 3 countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Emirates. And if we look at the financial side of it, the personal remittances as a percentage of GDP, it's fluctuating, but the average is around 7.44. The minimum is 4 point something, and the average for the world is around 5% or like that. So it's we are higher than the rest of the world. So that's one aspect. And if we look at the female to male labor participation, we have low participation rate for Egyptian women. So why we are worried? Because the migration in Egypt comes from patriarchal, as we say, patriarchal system. So this will affect the gender norms and how the society perceives how women and men behave and act. And this will affect gender empowerment, and definitely this will impact how the social development will occur in Egypt. So we are interested in how this will affect women left behind. And let's see the empirical evidence that's available for what we know so far and what we do not know. So for worldwide, the literature is scarce, polarized, and scattered with inconsistent results. But for the MENA region in Egypt, we have scarce but relevant and limited to return migrants. So this paper is, we are interested in the migrants, not the returned ones. So we have the conclusions that we got that return migrants, they are more conservative. They have gender norms than the ones who are not coming from returned migrants. So the objective is we have the Egyptian labor market survey. We got the data from 2006, 2012, and 2018. So we're interested in replicating the paper from Benzel and Assad 2011. That's for the labor market outcomes for the women. And we are interested in women empowerment. So we're interested to see Samurai 2021. We're interested in return migrant, but we're interested in the migrants that we have already there. So here, as I said, we have the ELMPS. It's relevant, yes, because it's a very rich data set where we have information about migrants and the remittances, and there is a rich model on gender norms. So we have a sample of 14,063 households. It's a very big data set, and we are restricting to only women from 20 to 60 years old. So that's what we have. And for the results, if we look at the data, we have the share of migrants from urban to rural. The rural ones are higher. And if we look at the relationship to migrants, most the case is that the husband is the migrant in the rural and in the urban. And let's confirm that it's our countries that the Egyptian migrants go. And this is the variables that we are working with. So we have two batteries of dependent variables, one for the labor market participation and the second for the women empowerment. So we are concentrating about wage work, substance work, and non-paid work. And for the dependent variable, the second battery is that the women decision making, the women mobility, and having a personal saving. For the explanatory variable, we have a dummy for being a migrant versus not a migrant, receiving remittances versus not receiving remittances, and we have the control variables, the socioeconomic ones, female-headed, wealth index, education, age, number of children, and percentage of men in the household. And we have an IV variable, which is the percentage of household with a migrant in the region. So the empirical strategies that we are adopting is the IV approach because of the self-selection bias and the reverse causality, because of the being in the remittances and the labor market outcomes will be affected in being endogenous because of the migration. And this is our model. We have first stage and second stage. And these are our results. And as we can see here, if we are comparing the rural with the urban, being in a migration versus not a migrant, so we have here the wage work has decreased, significantly decreased, the substance work increased, and the unpaid work increased. If we look at, that's for the rural. If we look at the urban, the wage work decreased, but it wasn't significant, versus the substance work and the paid work were increased, but not the same influence like the rural households or women who are left behind. For the remittances, the story were highlighted more with having the remittances. So the urban, they have decreased with more magnitude and versus the rural ones. So we have here, we have the control variables, the yearly effect, and we have included clusters at the household level. As for the results for the women empowerment, we can see that we have here the rural and the urban, and the results were confirming that we have women empowerment influenced by being a migrant, and were more intensified with having the remittances. Yes, don't worry. So we reached to the conclusion is that does migration of male household in Egypt provide women with a venue to the labor market? Yes. But with for the rural, we have substitution effect more over the income effect. For the urban, we have the income over the substitution. And our results were women for the rural, they increase the labor supply through unpaid work and substance work. And this is confirming with the results of Dr. Ragi Asad. And if we are comparing with and without remittances, we have different type of migration households. So finally, for the empowerment, we said it's women were empowered, and this is where opposite to what been in the literature for the return migrants, and all the coefficients with the presence of the remittances, it's highlighting that women are empowered and they have their own decision to go out, to have their own saving, and to be more empowered than before, than having a household of non-migrants. And thank you. Thank you.
Stay here.
On time?
Can I ask a silly question?
Yes.
Sure.
I work in Canada. I feel the women whose husbands have gone to the Arab countries are totally empowered because they have freedom.
Yeah.
And they have,
When the husband comes back, it
they have to
reverses.
do,
It reverses.
they have to do a lot of the stuff that the man used to do, which is rugula, they're having to cope with the children's schools, all kinds of things, and they have more money. Let him stay abroad and
Yeah.
be very happy.
We're all happy.
So thank you very much. I go to a few comments, very few comments. So I think it's important to have the family relationship with the migrant is important.
Okay.
So if it's different if the mother of the migrant or wife or sister receive the remittance. It's completely different. So if you can put this relation, it's good. Also, the amount of the remittance is also important.
Okay.
And in your paper, you cannot not compare women of male migrant receiving remittance to those not receiving it. So
Okay.
it is one of the limitation, and not information about whether the migrant has returned
No, we don't.
with or not.
We don't
if
have
you can have
such.
this,
It's not in the data.
Okay. And also, I think you should control with more household characteristics.
Okay.
So you include the number of child,
Yeah.
the percentage of man in the household, but also if in the household the number of people aged
Yeah.
64, 5 and over, and the number of sick people in the household, because they can impact the behavior of women in the labor
Exactly.
market.
Yes.
So we open Ragi Assad, Rania,
And
for
just-
question. Go
yeah.
Ragi Assad. Sorry.
Thank you for a very nice paper and
Thank
for confirming our work from 2011, which I think is great. The only thing you said that we only looked at returned migrants, that's not true. We looked at current migrants.
Okay.
So that's not a distinction with our paper. Now, Jacqueline Wahaba's paper, which you also mentioned, the two children Wahaba paper, looked at both current migration and return migration.
Okay.
And in fact, she showed that women are empowered when the men are gone, but then when they return, she is less empowered than if they had not left at all. So they return back with gender norms that are worse than what they would have been if they had not gone at all. So they are reverse disempowered.
Send them away.
So I think this is an interesting distinction that they found in their paper, and then they also find that going to the Gulf in particular creates even more disempowerment when they come back with those norms.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question for Fred, and if I was wrong. You mentioned that the unpaid work increased. Okay, you might need to include something like whether they live in family housing or not.
Okay.
By family housing, I mean big عيلة.
Oh.
It's not like
Extended family.
extended family housing. Or you can know this by the relationship variable, whether the mother-in-law or father-in-law are there or not. I mean, it's definitely can be separate household, but within the same building. I don't know whether this is included in. It's there. So you might need to include this as well because there's some norms.
Norms.
Yeah, he just leave her here to help and serve
Yes.
his parents.
But this is non-wage work. It's not unpaid.
Yeah, she mentioned
It's
substance work.
So this is farm work that is increasing. So it's not just unpaid household. I don't think she has unpaid household.
She mentioned substance work.
Subsistence.
That's still productive agricultural work. It's not
She
household.
might, yeah, they might use her to help them in their businesses.
Yeah.
Maybe she combine them together.
It's just the labor
Unpaid
supply.
work.
There's one less person in the household, work increases for everybody else. That's what's happening here.
Maybe she can confirm this. I missed how we included the panel. You're working with the panel, include them, and you're including like a time dummy.
Yeah.
Because why didn't you think of like lifeguards? Like
Okay.
Like why, like for example, they migrated and now we're talking about the characteristics of the woman now. In this way, you're going to be avoiding, I think, the indigeneity, which is
Yes.
still my second question. The indigeneity is not very clear to me. Like you're thinking like if he, like decision making and the husband migrating. We don't know when they migrated to say like it's like a simultaneous decision and why about the indigeneity.
Yes.
These things seem to be written clearly.
Okay, yes.
How you're thinking about it. Second, like when you think of the IP, I'm a little bit skeptical about the IP, your choice
Yes.
of the IP itself.
Yeah.
Like, the percent of migrants will certainly affect
Yeah.
the probability of a person to migrate in the community.
Yes.
But at the same time, they will affect the women empowerment and in the community, which will affect like the decision-making power and the women empowerment their own characteristics. So it's not, we cannot say it's really I wouldn't say it's really a good, it's an exogenous variable.
So,
it will probably affect also her decision. It's endogenous also with her own decision. Like the percent of the migration in the community, migrants in the community. And I think that's why you're suggesting to add more controls about like community controls.
Yeah.
Maybe can help us out.
Thank you very much. So you have just 1 minute.
yes, thank you so much for the comments. Yes, it wasn't a return migrant for you, but it was for the other papers. And I'm interested, yes, in seeing, going back to Dr. Jacqueline's paper and see how to confirm it with our results. And for Dr. May comment, yes, definitely having this would be value added to the paper. And for Hadritic, it would be a good thing to have the lags, and definitely adding more to the how to explain the indigeneity in this. But if you have like another variable that can work with, like an IV for the estimation, would be.
I think this is usually all our paper having this problem.
Yes.
That's why Ravi didn't really do he did like some propensity matching techniques, and that's why he didn't just go with the regressions. We're talking about the same paper. But that's first I told her, why do you need an IV if you're going to use lag? But if she's the same time period and she needs the IV, she's saying like I need the IV, then it's endogenous by itself.
Right.
The IV is
At least
endogenous.
it's not excluded.
No, what I'm saying is, for the research questions, you don't need an IP. It doesn't really matter, does it?
I think like if,
you can check the robustness of result using propensity score matching inside each function with mirroring and non-mirroring in the house.
Okay.
It's different to the EV, and it can be robust, more robust than in this one, using the propensity score matching. I think.
Okay. Thank you so much.
So there are just 10 minutes left in the coffee break. We might go to...
So thanks to our speakers.